Anytime I create a new API, there are two different controllers that I always add. The first one is a status controller, and this controller is one that I call from a monitoring tool to check on the status of my API. And the second controller is for throwing errors, which I know sounds kind of weird, but when I show you what it's used for, you'll see why it's very helpful. So let's jump into the API and I'll show you how this is set up. This API here is a .NET API, but the general concept of what I'm going to show you can be applied to any type of API that you write. So the first thing I'll show you is the status controller. And like I mentioned, I call this endpoint from monitoring tools to check on the status of my API. And this first endpoint right here is just a really super simple GET call. And the purpose of this is just to make sure that the API is up and running and it can serve requests. And all I'm doing is returning an object with a message that says all good, and then the server time with the current time. And this endpoint can kind of be thought of as a health check, like, hey, are you alive? Are you working? Is everything okay? And you can call this endpoint just to make sure that your API is working. Now, more than likely, your API is going to be talking to a database or some other type of service. So you may want to check to make sure that it can do that as well. And this call right here is an example of what that would be. This would be a status check for the database. And so it has a route of /db. And I don't actually have this hooked up to a database right now. So you'll just have to imagine that this is making some type of database call. You could either get a single record, or what I like to do is just say select the current date. And then if that call is successful, you return a message that the DB is up. And like before, I'm also including the server time. And I also include the return date from the database. And of course, you can modify this to return whatever you want. And the goal of this endpoint is to make sure that our API can talk to our database and can successfully retrieve data from it. And then another frequently used endpoint that I use is some type of a call to check on the authentication service that I'm using. And this, of course, all depends on how you do authentication in your API. But in this call, you could pass your token or your username and password to this, make sure that your service is working. And so this endpoint is just /auth. And you can see here that I have an authorized tag on this. And so with that authorized tag, I know that if it even gets in here at all, that means that it was successful, authorization is working, and I return 200 OK. And how you do authorization is beyond the scope of this video. I am going to do another video in the future that's going to show how I'm doing this one, which is basic authentication. But hopefully you can see the advantage of how this could be helpful for you. And so those three calls are ones that I usually add to all of my APIs. Now, let's just say, for example, you have other things you want to check on. Maybe you have a caching database you want to check on. You could put in as many endpoints in here as you want. You could add those endpoints to your monitoring service. And then this way you know that everything in your API is working as it should be. And in this video, I'm not going to show how I set up the monitoring of these endpoints. That kind of really is up to you on what tool you want to use. But I am going to do a video on how I like to do it, which is using Google Cloud. And so if you're interested in seeing that, keep an eye out for that video here not too long in the future. So really quick, I will go ahead and run this API and I'll open up the Swagger page and I'll show you the responses that you get from these endpoints. Okay, here is the Swagger page, and here you can see my 3 endpoints. So I'll just really quickly try out this first one and execute it. And you can see I get back a 200 with a message all good and the current server time. Second one is the DB check. Same thing, execute it, you get back a 200 with a message. The message is DB is up with the current server time and also the database time. And like I said before, feel free to change this and do whatever you want with it. And then lastly is the auth check. So if I say try it out and execute, you can see actually I'm getting back a 401 because I didn't add in my authentication to this call. So if I come up here into Swagger, put in the username, which is password is subscribe, go ahead and log in and close that, and I make that call again. And now you can see it's passing the authorization header, which is just a basic token. And now it says auth is up and it gives me the current server time. So like I mentioned before, I am going to do a video on this and how to add that basic authentication for a .NET API. So look forward to that. Okay, now let's move on to the errors controller. And like I said, this controller, all it does is it throws errors. And the reason I really like this is I use it from my user interfaces to make sure that I have a good user experience when the application receives specific types of errors. And so you can see here I have a bunch of different endpoints, and that will always throw the exact same error every time whenever you call that endpoint. So if I call errors /401, I will always get back a 401. If I call errors /403, I always get back a 403. Same thing with 404, and then also just a generic 500 error. And I know it does sound kind of weird to have a controller that is dedicated to throwing errors in your application, but trust me when I say that if you use this from your user interface to ensure that if you call an endpoint and you get back a 401, that your application does the right thing, which is maybe redirect to the login page or just show a page that says you're not logged in, click here to go log in. And if your application is trying to access a page that doesn't exist and it gets back a 404, you want to make sure that it shows a page that says, hey, that doesn't exist. I personally think that this is super invaluable for making sure the user experience is nice on interfaces. And as you can see, I only have a few different errors in this example here, but if you want to expand this and add as many errors as you possibly want, feel free to do that. So I'll go ahead and run this, and I'll just really quickly show you the responses that come back from this. Here is the errors controller with all the different endpoints. So if I call a 401, I will always get back a 401 unauthorized. So I think you get the point. I don't think I need to do all these. And just like with the setup of the monitoring tool, the setup of the user interface and how it calls these endpoints is a little bit out of scope of this video, but I will be doing a video on that very soon. I'll probably be doing it in Next.js. So if you do want to see that, make sure you hit the subscribe button and the little bell so you know when that comes out. I hope this video is helpful for you guys, and I hope it kind of got the wheels turning a little bit on different things you can use endpoints for monitoring and user experience. If you like this video, let me know in the comments down below, and thanks for watching, and I'll catch you later.